I think a prejudice against intelligence or a prejudice that involves intelligence is kind of the last acceptable form of prejudice that we have. We find it perfectly okay to call each other stupid as an insult. And what we're saying when we do that is that to be intellectually incapable is bad and to be intellectually capable is good. Because our thoughtscape in the Western world is based on Descartes and his I think, therefore I am. So he went, I think, therefore I am. But we latched onto that in the Western world. We're saying the I is in the think. What I am is what I think. How much I think is how much I am. How good I am at thinking is how good I am. And when you found the I in think, it leads you in a certain direction. And it's not that that direction is wrong. It's just the understanding of it as the whole story is flawed. Because he could just have easily have said, I feel, therefore I am. And in what direction would that have led us?
Welcome to Everlutionary, a podcast about how we can heal and transform with the world. Every episode of my show, we explore conversations around philosophy, science, mysticism, social justice, how we can be change catalysts and activators and mobilize each other to create a world free of violence. I'm your host, Hawah Kasat. Hello, Joanna. Thank you so much for joining the Everlutionary podcast. How are you today? What's on your heart? How have you been?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Can you tell us where you're calling in from today?
I am in England and I'm right down at the very bottom on the little tippy toe part in Cornwall.
Amazing. Well, thanks for making the time and thanks for all the incredible work you do in the world. For our listeners out there, can we start by you telling us what's the most important part of your work? What's the part of your work that makes you come alive every day?
The part of my work that is most important is connecting with, representing, working for, with, on behalf of people with profound intellectual and multiple disabilities.
Yeah, and you're working right now on a PhD research specifically around identity and belonging for people with profound and multiple learning disabilities. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're finding in your research and what's driving the research?
So this is hot off the press news. So I recently completed my PhD. I am a few weeks into being Dr. Jo Grace. So I sound much more grown up now. But my research was looking at, like you say, identity and belonging for people with profound intellectual and multiple disabilities. But I was specifically looking at belonging within research because people with the most complex disabilities are vulnerable and marginalized in many ways. And one of the ways is through their exclusion from research. So we've got a lot of really great inclusive research practice that looks at hearing from voices that we previously haven't heard from. And over the last 20 years, we've made amazing strides at including people with intellectual disabilities in research.
I'm curious to know, how do we define or understand, or could you just put into really simple terms, what does it mean when you say somebody with limited intellectual capabilities? What does that even mean?
So this demographic they get the auspicious title in research as the most disabled members of our community. So people with profound intellectual and multiple disabilities will have multiple physical disabilities, multiple sensory impairments. I mean, it used to be defined according to IQ, but IQ is such a rough definition of intellectual capacity that it's a bit of a botch. But you are thinking about people who essentially do not have intellectual capacity, and then they will have multiple health complaints that go with that. It's really common for people to have epilepsy, and a lot of the people that I work with are life limited, so they lead foreshortened lives, and they have high pervasive support needs. They would need care around the clock for all aspects of life.
And so when you're saying limited intellectual capacity, are you saying that these individuals may have a hard time doing problem solving, having communication, or like having interpersonal relationships that are healthy? Are you saying, is there an emotional quotient that's a part of this, or is it just intellectual? I'm still like looking for the ground.
The description is intellect. And your question about emotion is a really interesting one, because generally we get judged according to our intellectual capacities. We don't go to school and rate ourselves on our emotional capacities, do we? But we've all got a score for our intellectual capacity. So we are scoring these people essentially on their intellectual capacity. And you hear people say things like, oh, they have the intellectual ability of a baby in the first few months of life, which is drawing a comparison with what their literacy skills might be, and that you wouldn't expect a baby to read. You wouldn't expect a baby to recognize symbols. You wouldn't even expect a baby to recognize a photo of itself. But actually that comparison is inaccurate, because those babies in the first few months of life have the potential to become intellectually capable people. And the complexity of these people's brains means that oftentimes they don't have that potential, or that capacity is thwarted in, if you have epilepsy going off in your brain, that is going to mess with your capacity to think. So these are people who have no access to standardized forms of communication. So they don't have speech, they don't have sign, they don't have symbol communication. They might not be able to indicate a yes or a no. This is the most profound level of intellectual disability that you can imagine. So, for example, there's a condition where you can be born without a brain. If you put you in a brain scanner, your skull is just fluid. These people have the top of their brain stem. They have the ability to blink, to breathe, and to smile, and they do not have intellectual capacity at all. And so my work needed to be capable of including people like that.
Wow. That puts a lot of this into context. And thank you for that really descriptive understanding of what we're exploring here.
I've been running a thing called the Sensory Projects for the last couple of decades. And everything about the Sensory Projects is about meeting these people and engaging with these people. And when you describe them according to a list of medical needs and physical needs and sensory, they sound so desperately dry and boring and, truly tragic. But actually, the work is creative and fun and just wonderfully human. And getting to meet these people and spend time with them is, I'd say, such a privilege, but then it makes it sound like I'm putting them on a pedestal. And I don't mean that it's any more of a privilege than it is to spend time with anybody else. It's just that it's so rare that you get to spend time with these people. It's a bit like if there was a hermit living on a hill that never spoke to anybody, but you got to go and sit and have a cup of tea with him. That would be a really significant cup of tea. And it's not that it would necessarily be any better a cup of tea than the cup of tea that you have with your best friend. It would just be the rareness of it that is special. And it's like that. And I've totally forgotten your question because I got carried away.
No, that's fine. I'm just so intrigued by the empathy that must be cultivated through this interaction and through this incredible opportunity to sit and be with those who are really driven by their sensory perceptions more so than their ability to navigate the world through intellectualizing the world. And so, what I'm understanding is that the essence of your work is learning how through the senses we are creating profound understanding about how the different ways that people are learning and all the ways that we approach learning, and how do we as a society, as a people, how do we integrate people that have different ways that they learn into the fabric of society and culture.
So in that meeting with people with profound intellectual and multiple disability, it's a really interesting challenge for somebody who has intellectual capacity, because in the moment of meeting, you are in that moment. But as somebody with intellectual capacity, I will plan that moment ahead of being there. So I will spend time in that moment before I've got there. When I'm in that moment, very little of me will actually occupy that moment, because half of me will be wondering what everybody else is thinking about me as I'm doing whatever it is that I'm doing in order to connect with this person. Half of me will be thinking about picking the children up from school. A bit of me will be thinking about how I'm going to describe what I did right now, because I have to write it up from my research. Very little of me occupies that present moment. Once I've left that moment, I'll occupy it again as I reflect back on it. So I spend a lot of time there, but in the moment that I'm there, very little of me is present. And in order to meet people with profound intellectual and multiple disabilities, a lot of the people that I work with don't have the capacity to reliably form memories. So they don't have a past to agitate over. They don't have an understanding that there's a future coming. So they're not thinking ahead to that. They're not aware that there are people watching us. They are wholly there in that moment. And if you want to meet them, you have to bring as much of yourself into being in that present moment as you can. And that's where you get those connection points. So doing it in a sensory way is a really lovely and just fun way of doing it, because I can't communicate with them using standardized forms of communication, but we can look together, we can feel together, we can smell together. So some of the fun things that I do at the Sensory Project, one of my favorite things is sensory stories, where you can share narratives using sensory experience. We use words as well, but you're sharing a narrative that is inclusive of somebody who might not use words.
Wow. So you're somehow creating a story together without using words and only using senses.
Yeah, it's so much fun.
Wow.
So one of the things that concerns me, I used to be a teacher, and the last thing you want to do is patronize somebody. They could be sat there in this really complicated body, understanding everything that you say. Or they could be sat there in a really complicated body, unable to lay down memories, unable to understand what you say. And I want to be able to meet everybody that they might be. And so in creating sensory stories, I try to create stories that would be respectful of intellectual capacity, but accessible at a sensory level to somebody who has no intellectual capacity. So one of my favorites is about how stars are formed in stellar nurseries. So this isn't a fictional story. I worked with scientists to create this story, and it tells with scientific accuracy how stars are formed in stellar nurseries. And it's just 7 sentences long.
In stellar, how stars are formed where? In what?
In stellar nurseries. So, you know, when stars are born in space.
Yeah. Okay.
So they start off as great big hydrogen clouds, and the hydrogen particles all sort of swirl around until they form spinning clusters of gas. And then the gas falls in on itself and gets squeezed and gets hot, and then fusion begins. And then you get this illumination of a new star. And I can tell you that in a sensory way by creating a visual experience of the stellar nurseries, which are the dust particle clouds. So I just throw up handfuls of confetti, because the particle dispersion in a cloud of confetti is very similar to the particle dispersion in a hydrogen cloud. And visually, you don't have to understand what you're seeing in order to be interested in the fluttering movements of confetti. If you chuck up loads of confetti, then it doesn't matter if somebody's got a close-up focal distance or a far-away focal distance. Sometimes I make it out of white hole punchings and fluoresce it under a UV light. And then when you chuck it up, it looks like a firework going off. So you have this visual impression that is accurate to the science in that sentence. You're talking about particulate clouds and you are creating one. The visual reference is correct. And then as the particles get squeezed and get hot, I use one of those little hand warmers that you can get where you squeeze them and they get hot. So again, you've got the meaning in the sensation that's there in the words. And I think people get very attached to words because it has a really significant effect on your brain when you acquire language. It changes the structuring in your brain. It changes the way you lay down memories. It changes how you access memories. And so when you have words, you think that words are meaning, but words are just one tool that we use to express meaning. And anybody who's seen a piece of contemporary dance or something will appreciate that there is meaning in movement. There is a picture speaks 1,000 words. There's meaning in vision. There's meaning. And the meaning of these things to do with star formation or whatever the story might be is there in the sensation. And by sequencing that meaning, you can create that feel of a story without it relying on words for you to access.
It's amazing because is it true too that like some of our most primal or like earliest memories or most impactful memories are from smell?
So smell is a really interesting one. Yeah, smell is the only sensory system processed by the limbic brain. So all your other senses are processed by the thalamus, which is your thinking brain. So you can think vision. If I say Van Gogh's painting of the Starry, Starry Night or Edvard Munch's The Scream, you see an impression in your mind's eye. You can think sound. So you can get songs stuck in your head. You hear them. It's not the same as actually hearing them, but you're thinking the sound in your head. But you can't think a smell. And we don't have the language to describe smell. With visual experience, I've got hundreds of words I can use to describe a visual experience. With a smell, I can just say, smells like, and then I name another smell. And that's because you don't think smell, you feel smell. And so, yeah, we have scent memories that are generally tethered to really positive experiences. Obviously, nobody likes the smell of hospitals, so it's not a universal that they're tethered to positive moments. But yeah, some of our really early memories would be scent-based.
But what about taste then? Is taste not also part of that limbic system?
Taste is a really naff sensory system. We only taste 5 flavors. The rest of taste is from smell.
Oh, okay.
So when I'm talking to big audiences, if you give everybody jelly beans and get them to hold their nose and eat the jelly bean, if you hold your nose and eat a jelly bean or hold your nose and eat a Skittle, what you find is that it tastes sweet and you really notice the texture of it more than you did before. You can really feel that you are mashing something up in your face. And then you get everybody to let go of their nose and the whole room goes, ooh, because they discover that they're eating a lemon jelly bean or they're eating a strawberry flavored Skittle. But until you've got smell working in partnership with taste, you don't know that.
Oh, wow. Okay, so everybody listening, go ahead and get yourself a jelly bean and don't look at what flavor it is. And then hold your nose and start chomping away and then let go and start breathing.
That's it. Yeah, it's called retronasal tasting, which is also just a great phrase. So go and retronasally taste a jelly bean.
That's fascinating. So I love this story telling and framing. I want to ask you about a word really quick, and the word is disability. And I'm asking because I don't know what's right and what's wrong. And I'm curious because I remember years ago having some opportunity to learn about like some groups of people who felt that wasn't the proper word to use. And I don't know, because I know we're all trying to be politically correct these days. And I'm just curious. And also, I'm in the United States, you're in Europe. There's different ways that even like we from different parts of the earth can relate to words and language. So I want to just name all of those various factors in this. But I wanted to ask you about, we've used the word disability a lot. Have you or do you explore the use of that word? Is it empowering? Is it disempowering for the people you work with?
So that is a massive, massive topic. But I'm hesitating because I don't want to overly simplify it. And what you've asked is like an entire section of disability studies, and we'd need a week. But the term disabled is not a bad term to be using, but it is if you are locating the disability in the person. So to just do it in a first 2 hits kind of a way, if you're looking at a medical model of disability, that would say the person is disabled, that there's something wrong with that person, they're disabled. A social model of disability would say that the disability comes about between the person and the environment. So a person who uses a wheelchair to get around is disabled in an environment that's full of stairs and has no lift, but is perfectly able in an environment with ramps and decent lift access. And the disabled community will use the word disabled under a social model meaning as an act of advocacy, because they are pointing out that they are being disabled by people. And I don't know if you noticed, but when I was talking about people with profound intellectual and multiple disabilities, when I was talking about their intellectual disability, I would have said intellectual impairment, because you might have a physical impairment, as in your legs don't work. Having that physical impairment doesn't necessarily mean that you are disabled. It's the matchup between yourself and the environment that will create the disability or the ability. There are particular communities where a condition is considered to be an identity rather than a disability, but other people would describe it as a disability. So the autistic community is a community that holds identity first language. The deaf community is a community that holds identity first language, whereas other communities prefer person first language. I have never come across anybody who wants identity language associated with epilepsy. You would always be a person with epilepsy because you're saying epilepsy has nothing to do with me. This is a problem that I have. This is a bad thing. I would like this fixed. Whereas deaf people, autistic people feel that being deaf, being autistic is a valid way of being. So you hold it as an identity rather than as a disability.
Wow.
I've muddled up 2 topics within the bigger, broader topic there.
Yeah, but for somebody like me who's not a PhD in this type of work and language, I mean, you just opened my mind up to so much in just that short, brief explanation. Especially, first of all, I love the word impairment in some ways because it does point to there's an external factor involved here, right? I'm impaired, not I'm impaired, society's impaired. I'm impaired because I live in a world that doesn't have the wheelchair ramps I need or the elevator I need or the type of school access I need, whether that's like a classroom that teaches to my specific learning style, right? So I'm being impaired by the external world as well.
Yeah, it's being disabled. It's like a switch. So the impairment would be, if somebody can't see, we're not pretending that their experience of disability is totally separate from their physical being. We're not sort of going, oh, don't mention that they can't see, or don't mention that he's got no legs. Like, we've got to have a way of talking about that. So you'd be visually impaired, you'd have a physical impairment, and that's denoting the physiological aspect of that. But you're not saying that the impairment causes disability. You're saying that the social setup around you is causing the disability.
Wow. That's really powerful. Thank you for that. And then these ways that we even consider the intellect, the way we consider and the way we value or judge intellect in our society. I'm curious if that's something that you grapple with in your research and your work, because I sometimes think about how, as an educator and somebody that's been working with youth for most of my career, how so many young people, they come into classrooms with perhaps a learning style that is not the mainstream, most taught towards learning style, which kind of puts them onto the fringes because maybe they're kinesthetic learners, maybe they're spatial learners, maybe they're musical learners. So I'm kind of curious, how do you see even intelligence in this way as something we're trying to get our hands around, as like a society that values one type of intelligence more than another? Is that something that we can somehow create more openness around? And if so, is there any ways that your research is working towards opening or creating pathways for us to think more broadly and inclusively about intelligence?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one because I think a prejudice against intelligence or a prejudice that involves intelligence is kind of the last acceptable form of prejudice that we have. We find it perfectly okay to call each other stupid as an insult. And what we're saying when we do that is that to be intellectually incapable is bad and to be intellectually capable is good. And everything about our society tells you that to be intellectually capable is good. And you should always be pushing to be more intellectually capable. And I think it sounds really out there to say that it's really important to look at the philosophical foundations that our thoughtscapes are based on. Our thoughtscape in the Western world is based on Descartes and his I think, therefore I am. And he was trying to figure out if this is all imaginary or not. And he was going, oh, maybe my shoes are not here. Maybe I'm dreaming my shoes. I can doubt that my shoes are here. Maybe this sandwich that I'm eating is not here. I can doubt that this sandwich is here. And he did this process of doubting. And the thing that he found that he couldn't doubt was that he was thinking. So he went, I think, therefore I am. We latched onto that in the Western world. We're saying the I is in the think. What I am is what I think. How much I think is how much I am. How good I am at thinking is how good I am. And when you found the I in think, it leads you in a certain direction. And it's not that that direction is wrong. It's just the understanding of it as the whole story is flawed. Because he could just have easily have said, I feel, therefore I am. And in what direction would that have led us? And when I work with people who have profound intellectual disability to an extreme degree, there's lots of grotty stuff that goes on around these people. These people have higher rates of abuse than other people. They're more at risk than other people, especially people who can't use words, who can't use standardized forms of communication, who can't tell somebody else what might have happened to them. They are a very, very vulnerable population. And there's lots of horrible stories of their mistreatment and poor care practices. And you look at the things that are done to them in those awful situations and you think, how could anybody do those sorts of things? And I talk about on my training days the ways in which we used to treat these people when they were institutionalized. And it's really easy for us in the contemporary world to look at those treatments and go, oh, I would have never done such things. Those people are awful. how terrible. But on my training days, I prefix it just before the tea break I show a picture of a fly on a picnic. And I ask people what they would do to the fly at their picnic. The fly is crawling on their jam sandwiches. What are they going to do to this fly? And there's a whole variety of answers in the room, but very few of them are humane. And what they tell you is what we do, how we feel it is okay to treat things that we think are less than human. And when the eye of human is in the think, these people become less than human in our eyes, and it becomes easier to treat them in awful ways. And we are touching distance from the ways in which these people were treated before. And you jump us forward another 20 years and people will look back at us and say, how could you have done these things? And so I think rather than looking at the practices in the institutions and thinking, goodness, what terrible people, I think it is more fruitful to question, what will people look back on us and say, how could you do those things? Because we're not finished, we're not cooked. We are not the height of ethical practice and human goodness. We've got a way to go yet.
Wow. I feel, therefore I am.
That would work, wouldn't it?
It would totally work. They could have said, I feel, therefore I am.
Yeah.
And how that could have changed perhaps the course of a lot of human history to follow. Your analogy of this fly is fascinating to me because it brings to mind for me the relationship that humans have with other animals, which often we feel because they're not thinking and as intellectually advanced as humans are, therefore we can treat them as if their emotions or their feelings are unimportant. And so they are less valuable. They mean less to society, to culture, to people. And because of that, we can treat animals in very inhumane ways because for some reason we just don't believe that they are as special as we are. And so it makes me think about what it means to be special and what it means to be valued. And when you describe the people you work with, I mean, these people are all equally valuable. We're all equally belonging on this planet. And yet, for some reason, so many of us are often marginalized and kept at the fringes. So that's what you just brought up for me, is that relationship of really feeling and understanding.
Often I'm inviting people into the present, into an awareness of what's going on for them at a sensory level. So in education, there's a curriculum that must be delivered. Within care, people have very limited amounts of time they're allowed to spend with people. I remember one setting telling me, the person told me, I am allowed 7 minutes to get somebody out of bed and to the breakfast table. And within that 7 minutes, they have to be washed, dressed, have their teeth brushed, and you've got all these other pressures. And so it's about finding ways to connect and make those moments meaningful. With the autism work, I look at the legitimacy of different neurotypes, and I am pushing for people to understand that neurodivergence is a neurotype rather than a behavior pattern. And that misunderstanding, or the need for that to be pushed, is because there is a misunderstanding created, especially around autism, but the other types of neurodivergence as well, whereby when people are identified, they're identified according to a pattern of behaviors. So a parent will take a child to a doctor and say, my child is, acting funny. We've got these odd behaviors. And when they're identified according to behaviors, then it leads people to thinking that this is behavior rather than neurotype. And it sounds like one of those, it doesn't matter type of decisions, but it's the same as the foundations. We're going back to the philosophical foundations of things. The foundational views that you hold change in such a big way what you do as a consequence. And so if I can get the right foundations in, I almost don't have to explain. I've been doing it in daft way recently by getting people to test whether their strategy that they're using to support an autistic person would help a cat in a swimming pool. Because you get autistic people who are very, very anxious. And people go, you should do mindfulness because mindfulness is great for anxiety. And mindfulness is great for anxiety. Would mindfulness help a cat in a swimming pool? Because a cat in a swimming pool is very anxious as well. And mindfulness is not going to help it because it will still be a cat in a swimming pool. And the point is that the reason that autistic people have these higher levels of anxiety is because they exist in sensory landscapes that were built on a presumption of a neurotype they don't own. Just in the same way that a cat in a swimming pool is in a sensory landscape that it doesn't want to be in. And that will heighten your anxiety. And being mindful or taking a deep breath or, trying not to scratch people doesn't help. And when you recognize that it's a neurotype, that it's a physiological difference in the brain, just as much as being a cat is different from being a dog, then you start thinking differently about things. And I can do you a daft example if you want.
Please.
So all of my work is based in research. I read a lot of the research around the areas that I work in. So generally when I'm speaking, I'm telling you things that are founded in research. This one comes from Facebook, which is the best form of research. So I am an autistic adult and I lurk on Facebook in groups that are for parents who are parenting autistic children. And those are very dangerous spaces to occupy as an autistic adult. They can be triggering in all sorts of ways. But I lurk there because I deliver training. And so I want to know what that experience is like. I want to know how people are supporting each other, what advice they might be hearing from people on Facebook. It is as much research to me as reading the journal articles is. I have a rule that I never comment, because if I pop up as an autistic adult policing a parenting group for how to parent autistic children, I will not be kept in that group for very long. So this is the example where I actually commented. And it was one of those posts where, so the lady had said, I've just come here to vent because I know you'll all understand. I know you all know how difficult this is. And she'd begun to tell us what she was venting about. And you have that option, do you want to read more? And then you click and it's like another 6 pages of internet comes up. And in this big description, she said, I will do a short version. She and her husband had met when they were at school. Everybody had been against their relationship. They'd got together when they were like 14. They've stuck it out. They both dropped out of school. They didn't get their exams, but they're both very hardworking. And she listed all the jobs and how hard they'd worked. They've had 3 children. The second child is autistic. She loves them all the same, especially the autistic child. She fights for the autistic child at school. She makes sure that he has all the things that he needs. And they've been together, 15 years now. The children are 2 and 6 and 10 or something like that. They've just got together enough money to buy their first house. And you get this description of this tiny little house, and she's spent all her money and time doing it up, and they've decorated it just nice. And her living room at home is her little sanctuary. It's only small, but she's got pictures all over the walls of her family. They've got a little TV. She's got it all just how she likes it, with the cushions and everything. And the autistic child is trashing the living room. And she loves the autistic child. She fights for the autistic child. She spends a lot of time in the post telling you how much she cares. Then she says, but it's really a lot. Like, I do a lot. I work really hard. I fight for him really hard. And at the end of the day, I just want to come home to a living room that I can feel safe in and relax in. I just want a couple of hours peace to myself. Like, is that too much to ask? And, everybody on the post goes, no, it's not too much to ask. And then because I'm really committed to my internet lurking, I read all the comments. So I read all these people asking her, have you tried this? Have you tried? And I learned in the comments that the way in which this child was wrecking the living room was he was trashing the wall of photos, all the pictures of second niece's new granddaughter, or all these pictures were being torn off the walls. And it turns out that the kid did the same at school. He was tearing down all the pictures off the walls at school, and school had tried everything with him. And generally, when education settings say that they've tried everything, they mean they have tried both the carrot and the stick in a variety of forms. So playtimes had been taken off him if he didn't leave the stuff on the walls. His mum had been told to not let him have his iPad if he didn't leave the stuff on the walls. They put up his own work on the walls to see if he would show some respect of his own work on the walls. It turns out he's still with his own work now. They tried everything.
They've taken down his own work.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what's happening is they're understanding it as a behavior. And when you see it as a behavior, that is a naughty child who needs to learn respect. He needs to learn respect for the work on the walls. He needs to learn the consequences of his behavior. He needs bigger consequences to behavior because he hasn't learned it. So take away the playtime, send him to the head teacher. At home, they tried similar things. They tried star charts. They tried, not letting him have the iPad is a classic because they're seeing it as a behavior. When you understand it as a neurotype, it totally switches. So if you understand it as a neurotype, you get curious about what about this environment is causing you to do this? Why? And it's interesting, isn't it? Because he's doing the same thing in both spaces. So he said, why would he be interested in being naughty at home if he's already naughty at school type of thing? And actually, it's an odd behavior for a child. If a child were looking to be naughty, not that I think that children actually do that, but they'd be really unlikely to go to the family photos. They're much more likely to spill something on the floor or steal the TV remote control, because those will be things they've got into trouble for before. They won't care two hoots that Aunt Doris is on the wall with her new niece. So why is he taking down the stuff off the walls? And if you get curious, what you find is that a lot of autistic people, not all autistic people, because nothing is ever all autistic people, but a lot of autistic people have hypervisual processing. So that means you see more. And it's amazing to me because I am an autistic person and I have hypervisual processing. But I read the research around this and I'm just fascinated by how little non-autistic people see. Because there's a great analogy that works. If you remember, you're probably not old enough, but if you're as old as me, you'll remember when TVs were three-dimensional objects and we had the old cathode ray TVs.
You mean the big boxes and they were heavy?
The big boxes, yeah. You had to get up. I didn't have a remote control. It was in black and white. I had to walk across the room and twiddle a knob, and there was only 3 channels in there. They created the image on screen by scanning across every pixel to see if it needs to change color. So like we're on screen now. If you scanned across here, these pixels up at the top of my screen have not changed color for the whole of here. But where I'm moving, where my earrings are moving, these pixels are changing color. And they would read every pixel, every frame. So that's an enormous amount of energy that they're using. They were not energy efficient, those old TVs. Whereas the digital TVs take a photo of the image on screen, and then they just know in their little digital brains which bits are moving and which bits are new. So they only actually have to expend energy on the bits that are moving and the bits that are new. So they're much more energy efficient. And if you think about that as in terms of they're only actually seeing the bits that are new and the bits that are moving, then you have an understanding of neurotypical sight. And it's the reason that people can do things like lose their keys and then find them in plain sight is because, especially in rooms that you're familiar with, you run off a photograph. It's not necessarily a photograph you took today. You can be running off a photo that's 3 days old and your keys weren't on the table in that picture. So you don't see them until you call them into your conscious brain. People say you should go around saying it out loud, where are my keys? Where are my keys? Because then you actively look and you see them. But they do experiments where I saw one where they'd got people to have a dinner party for their friends in their house, so in a room they're familiar with. And then after the dinner party, they say to them, did you see the gorilla at your dinner party? And they're like, there was not a gorilla at my dinner party. Like, Dave's a bit hairy, but you shouldn't call him that. And then they play the footage back and there's a cardboard cutout of a gorilla on the end wall. And because they have been running off an image that they had from before, they do not see it. But you think about that in terms of the energy used. And non-autistic people have often had an experience of being tired through seeing. So vision is a third of your cerebral cortex. It's a huge chunk of your brain. Your brain burns something like 90% of the calories that you eat in a day.
Yeah, the brain requires a lot of calories. It's one of the reasons that our brains grew is when we started to be able to increase food production and have lots of calories.
So if you've ever been on like a weekend break to a different city, or you've, done those holidays where you sort of wander around museums or galleries going, ooh, look at the architecture, look at the pictures. You get back to your hotel room at the end of one of those days and you sit on the bed and you go, we must have walked miles today. I'm exhausted. And you are more irritable with the children. You are less likely to read the book that you bought on holiday. You just want to switch the TV on, go to sleep, zone out. But actually, if you counted it against a typical day, picking the kids up from school, running around the supermarket, the steps are the same. You are tired from all the seeing. And what that child wanted at the end of his day at school was exactly what his mum wanted at the end of her day at work, was to come back to a living room in which she could just sit down and relax and feel safe. And the visually cluttered wall was requiring so much seeing. He'd done enough seeing, so he was clearing it. And when you see it as a neurotype, you get curious and it makes sense. When you see it as a behavior, you just tell the child off for being a cat in a swimming pool, and that doesn't make the cat any happier.
Yeah. Wow. He was a cat in a swimming pool because it's just overstimulation. And then that overstimulation led him to be needing to even just function or to be like able to sit in that room to have like a blank wall to look at because all those photos was too much visual sensory information for his brain to process. And it was driving him crazy.
That's what I popped up and commented. I said to the mum, could you clear a wall?
So you broke your own rule and you commented on Facebook. Yeah, you broke your rule.
I broke my rule. I know. I shouldn't do it, but it was just too tempting.
And she cleared a wall, hopefully, and maybe there was some solution. Wow, that is a fascinating story. And it really brings us to just how the neurotypes are so different. You did use a word earlier. You said neurodivergent, and I know that word is being used a lot lately. I've heard it more in the past few years than I had in like the decades prior, and maybe that's just my own fault for not hearing it.
No, it's new.
Is it new? Okay, could you really quick just explain like the 1-2 on that for people to hear it? But like honestly, a lot of times we just hear things and we don't really know what they mean. What does neurodivergence mean to you?
So the first term that you probably have heard is neurodiversity, and neurodiversity was coined to recognize that having different brain types is as natural and as useful as having different types of plants. Like we know biodiversity is a good thing. And so neurodiversity is a good thing. It's really interesting when you look at the genetics around the neurodivergent conditions. So conditions like autism and ADHD, you find that the genes that contribute to these conditions are all old genes. So they're not gene duplications or deletions or defects in the genetic code. Not that there is anything wrong with being a person who is a result of one of those, because I have some very dear friends who are. The significance of them being old genes shows you that they have had survival value. Old genes survive in our population because they have survival value. And it makes a kind of logical sense, doesn't it, that it would have been useful to have different types of brains for doing different types of things. Because we are puny little two-legged things. We don't have big claws or big teeth. We had to survive against, there were big four-legged things with big teeth out there. So it's important that we get together in groups. And we need a load of people who are really good at connecting up, getting together in groups, having babies with each other, having parties. We need neurotypical people. And when we were living in caves and living off berries and nuts and occasionally killing a wildebeest, you need those people who are going to form those social connections and connect us up as a society and a community into bigger groups. You also need Bob, who sits at the back of the cave no matter how great the party is and carries on with inventing the wheel. Because by the time Bob has invented the wheel, we'll be able to get away from the four-legged things with the big teeth faster. So Bob is useful to us too. And then you also need Jeff, who is really interested by what Bob's doing and what's going on at the party, but still stops to hear because a twig snapped outside the cave, because Jeff keeps us safe and Jeff keeps us connected. So the different neurotypes would have had value historically to us as a species. The experience of disability that we encounter now is because the different neurotypes are being asked to occupy environments built for just one neurotype. It's cats being asked to occupy swimming pools. So neurodiversity represents that there is a diversity of brains. And sometimes when I get booked to speak at conferences, because I am autistic, and some people know this, the people organizing the conference will sort of be saying, oh, you know, we've booked Jo and she's a bit neurodiverse and wonder if we're going to have to make any adaptations for her. It's like, I am not neurodiverse, because I just have the one brain. I can't be a diversity all by myself. As far as I know, just the one brain. So neurodivergent is a term that indicates brains that are other from the presumed norm. And the presumed norm would be neurotypical. So the neuro majority. I say neuro majority probably because there will be more of them. But actually, it's more an indication of power that those people in empower the people who have the main hold, neurotypical people.
Thank you for that. What a great explanation of neurodivergence. And I love this idea of like Bob in the back of the cave, like who might not be able to communicate very well and is mildly autistic, but is literally sitting there figuring out how to like invent the wheel. And then the person who's out there connecting all the other tribes and people, like that's probably not the person inventing the wheel. Like, so we need all these people to make humanity flourish.
Yeah, I'm slightly hesitant on my own example there because I'm not saying that autism is only valid if you invent the wheel, but the autistic brains are ones that are really good at focus on a single topic, and that has had value probably in maths and science and things like that. The mildly autistic is not a thing. So you hear people talk about the autistic spectrum, and sometimes people think that is a kind of linear spectrum that goes from not very autistic all the way to very, very autistic. Some people think it's a spectrum that includes everybody. So you would go from like very autistic. I have friends who don't use mouth words, who have lots of repetitive movements, whose behavior would be considered very peculiar, very autistic. And then people like me who are not very autistic because I can use mouth words and I can act normal. And then just across the line from people like me would be neurotypical people who are like really organized and good at maths. And then right down the other end would be my friend Vanessa, who always has a new boyfriend lined up for when she dumps the current boyfriend, is on the phone to at least 5 people to decide which boyfriend should be her current boyfriend. Severely, profoundly, desperately neurotypical Vanessa, who will, with the right support can achieve in life. It's not that kind of a spectrum. It's more of a color wheel type of spectrum. So you will see images where the autistic spectrum is represented as a color wheel, and different colors will be labeled with things like sensory differences. So we were just talking about visual processing differences, which is quite common. Communication differences. We've talked about people who might not use words. Executive functioning differences. And then you would draw on this wheel a kind of star shape to indicate how much of these things different people had. If you imagine a bunch of those different star shapes drawn and you put them all next to each other, how would you say which one was more and which one was less? So ultimately, being autistic is a binary thing. You either are autistic or you are not. And then when you experience that, if your experience is being autistic or your experience is being non-autistic, there is a spectrum of experience within those. But it's one of those places where the autistic community and the non-autistic community often clash with each other. It's terribly volatile in the Facebook land, and I have not commented on any of these posts. But to appreciate it, if you think of a different binary situation, so like being pregnant, you're either pregnant or you are not pregnant. You don't really go around going, oh, we're all a little bit pregnant. You don't really do mildly pregnant. I suppose you could sort of say, maybe you say severely pregnant, but you're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. If you're pregnant, there's a range of experience within being pregnant. Some people have a lovely time with it. Some people have a dreadful time. Not being pregnant, same thing, range of experience within it. So you imagine a pregnant lady talking to a not pregnant lady, and the pregnant lady says, oh, like the bump popped out over the weekend. I've had to put all my skinny jeans in the back of the wardrobe, and it's just so depressing because I'm in maternity wear now, and realistically, I'll probably never wear them again. And the not pregnant lady says, yeah, at Christmas, I put on half stone. All my skinny jeans are in the back of the wardrobe as well. Should we go to the charity shop together? And that feels really nice. That's understanding. And then the pregnant lady says, the baby's sitting really low on my spine and I just can't get comfortable at night. And people keep telling me to sleep as much as I can before the baby's born, but I just can't get comfortable. And not pregnant lady says, oh yeah, I picked up a load of boxes in the garage at the weekend and I twinged my back. And it's really difficult to sleep with a bad back, isn't it? Have you tried sleeping with a pillow between your knees? And it's lovely. The pregnant lady feels understood. It's all harmonious and sweet. And then pregnant lady says, the other thing that stops me from sleeping is I need to get up and wee like 5 times a night. I can't get any sleep because I'm just on the loo all night. And not pregnant lady says, oh yeah, I need a wee. I guess we're all a little bit pregnant. And at that point, the tone of the conversation totally changes. Like the pregnant lady is not friends with you anymore. Like, no, you are not pregnant. You're just fat and don't know how to lift up boxes. It totally, understanding the experience, lovely. Claiming the experience, very offensive. When the neuroscientists that study us look at our brains, they can see the pattern of a non-autistic brain very clearly at every level that they scan. So there's 3 types of resonance imaging that they use to look at brains. One of them looks at where the energy is kind of happening in a brain. One of them looks at the wiring connections in a brain. And one of them looks at a molecular level at how electricity passes through the little tiny, tiny parts of the brain. And at every level, they can see whether a brain is neurotypical or not. And it's really curious because when I read the neuroscience papers, and we didn't do a full introduction to my academic background, but I do not have a background in neuroscience. So it takes me a long time to read a neuroscience paper. I read it with a dictionary open so that I can understand what all the terms are. And you read a neuroscience paper and you think, got it. I understand what autism is in the brain because I read this paper and it said it is an overpopulation of close connections in the brain. So, we have these long distance connections that connect up the different sides of our brain, and we have close distance. Autism is too many close distance connections. And you read that as an autistic person, you think, yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense, because that's why I get so interested on this particular thing. It's because I've got a lot of, brain activity that can happen around that. And I'm not being distracted because there's none of these long distance connections. That makes sense. And then you read the next neuroscience paper and it says autism is an overpopulation of long distance connections. And you're like, hang on a minute, did I get the first one wrong? You go back and check. And you're like, no, these things are published in the same journal. Are you people not talking to each other? What's going on? And I found an account by a wonderful neuroscientist who explained it. And basically she said that non-autistic brains have a particular pattern. And when you pop them in the scanner, you can see that pattern. It's like saying tartan. You can tell when something is tartan or not. All tartans are individually woven. There's a huge number of different tartans. Every tartan is unique, but you can tell when something is tartan.
What is tartan?
Plaid. Does that read better?
Oh, plaid. Okay, some of this plaid. Yeah, that reads better.
It's like plaid, although all the Scottish people will hate me if I say it's like plaid. But there are loads and loads of different types of plaid. Each plaid could be individually woven. No 2 plaids are the same type of thing. If you put the brain in the scanner, you can tell this is plaid or not plaid, like it's stripy, it's spotty. But when you put another autistic brain in the scanner, it won't necessarily match the pattern of the first one. So the neuroscientists that study us describe us as having uniquely unique brains. They are other from the norm, and then they are other from each other. So the only thing we really know is what a neurotypical brain looks like. All of these neurodivergent brains are just not plaid.
So neurodivergent is autistic in some ways. Like, it's fair to say it encompasses neurodivergence, encompasses autism.
Neurodivergence would be autistic, ADHD.
Got it. So we put a cat in a swimming pool and all things go haywire. It reminds me of one of these quotes that I read, and I can't remember who said it, but something about you can't teach a fish how to climb a tree.
Yeah, like that.
That's a similar analogy to the cat in a pool. This has been an incredible conversation, very enlightening for me. I've learned so much from your deep knowledge and wisdom in these areas. We have so much to share, and your stories are just so funny and brilliant. I would love to ask you, as some closing advice or any ways that you would encourage listeners to think about how we can engage, how we can be better advocates, how can we support in being greater stewards of making the planet a more inclusive place for everyone?
I think meeting people with curiosity and acceptance is a good start point there, rather than a set of things that they have to live up to, a set of behaviors, a set of norms, a set of assumptions. All of those things, if you just are open and curious and ready to take people as they are and ready to believe that their experience is valid, then I think that's a good start point.
I love that. Thanks so much, Dr. Joanna. Congratulations, Dr. Joanna, for getting your PhD and completing that, I'm sure, that rigorous part of your life. It's no small feat. And thank you for the work you do in the world. And thank you for being on the Everlutionary podcast. I'd love to have you back. And for those that want to learn more about Dr. Joanna Grace and find her online, you'll be able to find her website, at the show notes below. So click on the website. You can find her on social media. Is there any other way that you'd love for people to connect with you, Joanna?
I really, as you can tell from my Facebook stories, I really enjoy social media and I occupy it a lot. So if people find my website, which is just www.thesensoryprojects.co.uk, they'll find all my social media contacts there. And if you are curious about my research, my thesis, recognizing the belonging of people with profound intellectual and multiple disabilities in research through a collaborative study of identity, is freely available for people to read online, as are quite a few of my papers. So come and find me, send me a message.
We're going to find you. We're going to send you a message. We're going to share these stories to everyone everywhere. Maybe we'll do some cross-collaborative posts on social media together when this comes out. Thanks again for your time. And thank you so much for the work you do in the world.
Thanks for having me.
Everlutionary, restoring balance and healing the natural world, is brought to you by me, Hawah Kasat. If you would like to find out more about me and my story, head to hawah.us. That's HAWAH.US. And then make sure to search for me in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Thank you for listening. Stay in touch. Peace.